So today, on April 10th, the House voted on passing the Kratom Consumer Protection Act here in Arkansas, and it failed. Um, they voted no pretty unanimously. The point of this video is going to be to address a lot of I don't even want to call it misinformation. It was just straight up lying throughout that I just heard, especially by a coroner whose testimony we're going to analyze here in a second. But I want to start by just expressing my gratefulness that this did end up happening in general. It was a bill that passed through the Senate that was led by a very popular Democrat and a very popular Republican in this state. So it was good to see bipartisan support, and it made it through the Senate with flying colors. And we get to the House, and two things happened that were pretty concerning. Number one, a coroner got he got on stage or went up to the microphone and just started lying. I don't know if he was consciously lying or if his understanding of kratom is really as bad as he made it out to be. Um, and we're going to analyze his testimony here in a second, but there's just this misunderstanding of drug use that these people have. Throughout his testimony, he made it very apparent that he does not think anyone uses kratom that is not an addict. He thinks the only way to use kratom is if you're trying to kick heroin, which is why he kept comparing it to methadone and buprenorphine. The vast majority of kratom users don't use it to quit other drugs. They use it because they enjoy kratom. And up to 15 million people use it yearly in the United States. There's not even 15 million heroin addicts in this country. So I don't understand why these are the people that we are allowing to sway our legislature. This guy is a coroner. He obviously is going to have some sort of confirmation bias when the only drug use he sees is in dead people. Maybe most of the drug users he sees in his life are dead, but that doesn't mean that even close to the majority of drug users end up dead or end up addicted. So that was a really huge problem with his testimony, and now we're going to go ahead and get into it. But again, I am happy that this happened at all. We're one of 6 states in the country where it is a Schedule 1 drug, and it was pretty encouraging to see it get through the Senate. Now, what happened in the House was obviously far from encouraging, and to make things even more disappointing, there will not be another chance to get this passed until 2027. So I think we need to, as a state and as advocates, need to take a step back and take these 2 years to really figure out what went wrong here and put forth a better bill, because even according to me, this bill was flawed, and I'll talk about that a little bit through this video. But I think we can hopefully learn from this and hopefully just increase education surrounding kratom, because some of the shit that I heard said in this hearing, it was genuinely unbelievable. It wasn't a normal level of drug rhetoric or misinformation, and I don't really like that word. It wasn't the normal shit you see. It was straight up 1930s anti-drug rhetoric, absolute nonsense. And we're going to jump into that right now. So, as we can see, the first claim that he makes here that had me completely shocked is that he said in low doses, kratom mimics methamphetamine. He provided no evidence for that. He provided no pharmacological mechanism as to why he would make that claim. What I think happened here is that it is known that in low doses, kratom is mildly stimulating. Okay? What he apparently does not know is that every opioid on the planet is stimulating in low doses. This is not something that is unique to kratom. Kratom is slightly more stimulating than most other opioids simply because it does have some adrenergic affinity, but every opioid will be a stimulating experience in low doses given the right environment. For example, if someone were to wake up and they're tired and they take a low dose of a drug like heroin, they will still be stimulated. It will wake them up and it will help them get through whatever they're doing, right? This is a well-known thing among drug users, and this is one of the things I mean when these people do not understand drug use. He definitely doesn't understand pharmacology, which is what I'm about to talk about, but opioids are used by millions of people for thousands of different reasons. It is not just to get high, it is not just to cure pain or help you fall asleep or sedate you. Those are reasons people use them, but they're also used for work so you can get through the day. They are used like coffee in some places. Poppy seed tea is a very common morning drink to have for many people across the world. Kratom tea in the morning is also a very popular beverage to drink. So this dude saying it mimics methamphetamine, I think he's basing that off the fact that it's stimulating in low doses and nothing else. Because, well, actually, I know it's nothing else because there is nothing else about anything related to kratom that is even close to being related to methamphetamine at all. The molecule's nothing like it. The pharmacology is nothing like it. Nothing about the drugs in kratom, which are mainly mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine. Nothing about those two molecules is related to meth pharmacologically or structurally. So this dude just made something up and got up there and said it with a straight face to people that are about to decide whether or not we should throw people in cages for possessing and using kratom. So let's talk about what methamphetamine does to the brain. First, I find it hilarious that the only drugs that he compared kratom to are drugs that he thinks are awful. Like he brought up heroin multiple times, which we'll address here shortly. He brought up methamphetamine, right? But I don't think that he would have ever mentioned that the kratom tree belongs to the coffee family of plants. And I'm not even saying he should have, because it's not pharmacologically similar to coffee, but it's also not pharmacologically similar to methamphetamine. So if we're going to go off these really obscure facts or about the plant, then why not mention that it's related to the coffee plant? It's because he knows that when he says, "Oh, it's like methamphetamine," that people are going to perk their eyebrows up because they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know anything about this topic clearly, right? So, let's talk about methamphetamine. The way methamphetamine causes its high is actually pretty complex. The amphetamines are a huge class of drugs, but their pharmacology it varies widely, right? Like you have MDMA, which is mainly serotonergic and causes a serotonin dump, but with methamphetamine, it's a dopaminergic drug. And the way it works is it releases some dopamine, but its main mechanism is that it reverses dopamine transport. So when dopamine is taken off the receptors and transported back to the host cells, methamphetamine reverses that transport and puts it back on the receptor, and then it inhibits its reuptake, which is why methamphetamine lasts so long. And it's why people who take reasonable amounts of methamphetamine, whether it's prescribed medicinally or recreationally, they tend to be motivated to complete things, they tend to be pretty hyperactive, they tend to feel pretty good, right? That it's all mediated by reversing this dopamine transport. Mitragynine doesn't do anything to dopamine transport. The only thing mitragynine does is agonize the mu opioid receptors. It's a competitive antagonist at the delta and kappa opioid receptors, and it's a partial agonist of the 5-HT2B receptor and has some affinity with the alpha 2 adrenergic receptor. None of these things are comparable to what meth does. It releases dopamine, but it releases dopamine via the opioid system. It does not reverse dopamine transport. It doesn't even get close to causing the same subjective or quantitative effects. And the fact this dude got up there with a straight face and said that methamphetamine or that kratom in low doses mimics methamphetamine is absurd. So I know it just like threw out a bunch of receptors there, which may have been lost on some people. So I'm just going to very simply explain what that means. There are receptors in our brain that react with different neurotransmitters. The opioid receptors react with neurotransmitters called endorphins, which stands for endogenous morphine. And when these neurotransmitters are absorbed by the receptor, it causes a reaction to take place in the brain. And in this case, it slows the GI tract, it releases dopamine, a little bit of serotonin, and that is why people report euphoria or mood boosts or even stimulated energy, right? It's because these neurotransmitters that already exist in our brain and already have a natural function are just being released on command. Now, What methamphetamine also does that kratom does not do is that it reverses norepinephrine transport as well and inhibits its reuptake as well. Norepinephrine is just the fancy word for adrenaline. That is why people get energetic after taking methamphetamine. That's why people who abuse it can stay up for 3 or 4 days. There is no one staying up for 3 or 4 days after abusing kratom. If anything, the opposite is happening. They're going to bed early and they're constipated, right? Those are the risks associated with kratom. If you take too much, you get nauseous, you may throw up, but that's it. No one's overdosing and dying from kratom, which is another issue that he brings up later that we're going to really analyze because he is spreading a bunch of bullshit, right? So just starting off with comparing it to methamphetamine, that was the first claim he made, is that it mimics methamphetamine in low doses. Again, as I just showed, there is nothing pharmacologically similar about the drugs in kratom and the drug methamphetamine. The next crazy line of thinking that he goes down is saying that history repeats itself and that we should learn from the past. Of course, we should only learn from the past that he wants to look at and not the past of tens of thousands of people dying from unregulated drugs when they're prohibited, people's lives being ruined by being thrown in jail, people being killed by police officers simply for possessing drugs. We shouldn't look at any of that. We should only look at this absurd comparison that he's about to make.
Tends to repeat itself. Heroin was designed as a medicinal purpose. Methadone, once it begun to be, heroin was abused, methadone was created to help people get off of the heroin as a relief. Methadone now is one of the largest over abused drugs. So we created Suboxone clinics, now Suboxone. So what I'm asking
Brings up the fact that heroin was originally created as a medicinal substance. Can anyone take a guess as to why it was used as a medicinal substance? Because it has medicinal properties. It is one of the best treatments for bronchitis that we know of. It is a great pain reliever. It helps with cancer pains. It helps with pains after surgeries. It helps with pains after broken bones. It can help stop diarrhea and make the person feel pretty good while they're treating the diarrhea. So, yeah, it was introduced as a medicinal drug because it is a medicinal drug. All drugs have medicinal properties. So, just bringing that example up doesn't make any sense. And here's another example of how he just doesn't know anything about pharmacology because he didn't say anything about morphine. The heroin's real name is diacetylmorphine, which means it has two acetyl bonds attached to a morphine molecule. Those acetyl bonds have no pharmacological effect at all. The only thing they do is make it slightly more potent. And by slightly, I mean like 2 to 5 times as potent, depending on the route of administration and the test subject used, right? In fact, when you eat heroin, it turns into morphine before it reaches your bloodstream, which is why no one is taking heroin orally because it's a waste of the drug. You snort it, inject it, or smoke it. And that prevents that acetyl bond from being cleaved and it enters your brain as heroin and 6-monoacetylmorphine. So he makes this comparison saying, oh, well, look, we already introduced this drug as medicine back in the 1890s, and look how bad it turned out. I'm not too convinced it really turned out that bad. We didn't really have a problem with heroin until Prohibition started, and then all of a sudden heroin's the worst drug in the world, right? But then he goes on to say we introduced methadone to treat opioid withdrawal. And he's like, now methadone is one of the most widely abused drugs in the world. And then he said, well, then we went to buprenorphine, and now buprenorphine's being abused. Can you take a guess as to why these drugs are being abused, dude? Because you're giving them to fucking addicts. Of course they're going to abuse it. When you're trying to treat addiction, which is a behavior pattern, a behavioral disorder that is caused by poor environments and poor mental health, you're not going to change that behavior pattern with a fucking molecule, man. So when you're giving people these drugs to treat their withdrawal and they don't want to stop being an addict yet, they're going to abuse the drug you give them to treat the withdrawal. That's not a mystery. And that same thing would happen with kratom, and no one is saying it wouldn't. But the fact that you're sitting here acting like these molecules are somehow responsible for them being abused, it shows two things. Again, that you don't understand drug use, and that you don't understand what addiction is. It is a behavior pattern, it's a behavioral disorder. It is not a pharmacological disorder, it is not a physiological disorder. It is a behavior pattern that these people abuse these coping mechanisms or these coping tools where they're self-medicating, they're to get out of their shit environment, to deal with their shit mental health, and it ends up becoming an unhealthy pattern for them. That's what addiction is. So when you give an addict buprenorphine, he's going to abuse the buprenorphine. When you give an addict alcohol, he's going to abuse alcohol. When you give an addict kratom, he's going to abuse kratom. I don't know what point he was trying to make here. I don't even think he knows what point he was trying to make. He just knows that saying the hit phrases they abuse these drugs makes everyone perk their eyebrows out because no one knows anything about drug use on that panel. Then he goes on to start talking about kratom deaths. This is a highly controversial topic, mainly because the two primary alkaloids in kratom, mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, they do not cause respiratory depression, which is the main mechanism for death by opioid overdose. Um, the main way that we see people dying from kratom use is basically shutting their liver down because they ate so much plant matter. You could do that with a lot of things. You can drink too much water and die. You can be exposed to too much oxygen and die. He kept saying things like, "We have pulled kratom out of the hands of a 25-year-old." What does that mean? When you pulled it out of his hands, what is that supposed to be telling us? That he died from kratom and had kratom in his hands? How are you able to establish that this person died from kratom? Because that's another huge issue that these coroners and people never talk about. They may not even know about it, which is a whole other issue. Is this It's a well-recorded thing called post-mortem redistribution, where people die from a drug overdose, and the way their blood flows after they die, it causes the drugs to collect in certain parts of the body. So if you take a reading from where these molecules and substances are collecting in the blood, you're going to get a very exaggerated reading for how much he actually had in his body because it's very concentrated in this one area. So when he's saying that we have confirmed kratom deaths, it's like, okay, I want to know how you actually confirmed that kratom killed this person. And two, I want to know how you were able to account for these redistribution phenomena. Until you can explain those two things, you will not convince anyone that knows what they're talking about that these people died from kratom.
On this as well. This is a general drug that is now tested nationally as a drug causing deaths or resulting in deaths. So just as recent as 2 or 3 weeks ago, we took crap.
In 2019, the CDC released a study that over this past 17 months, that's how long the study was, they were only able to attribute 100 deaths to kratom. 100 deaths in just under a year and a half. Alcohol kills 140,000 people a year. Tobacco kills 480,000 people a year. The unregulated illicit drug market kills around 80,000 people a year on average. So this guy is saying that it's being recognized nationally as a drug that kills people. Really? It's being recognized nationally as a drug that kills 100 people every 17 months. I'll take those odds, man. More people die in car accidents. I don't know how many people die from drinking too much water every year, but you know what? It's probably pretty comparable to that number. And he's using this as evidence to say, look, this is a lethal drug that people are taking and they're dying from it. And we see it in the coroner's office. He's making it sound like it's a regular thing. The reason that the number is so low is one, because of the pharmacological properties I just said, but two, is that there's a well known phenomenon that people who mix drugs tend to take lower doses of both drugs they're taking than they would have if they took them alone, right? So, but to be clear, polydrug overdoses are the most common type of overdoses, but right now, that's because people don't know they're taking multiple drugs, as I've pointed out in past episodes, and as most people who talk about this issue, they are aware of that. But with kratom, the only time that we're seeing deaths with kratom involved is when there's 6 other drugs in the person's system, and they're not assigning those deaths to kratom because they know it shouldn't be assigned to kratom. So I don't know if this dude is looking at every single death where kratom is in someone's system and considering that a kratom death, which is nonsense to begin with. That'd be like if someone dies of cancer but they took kratom the day before, ruling it as a kratom death. And I have a feeling that that's what that guy is doing. We are doing more postmortem analysis on people now than ever before in history. So of course, we're going to find more cases of people having drugs in their system when they died. That does not mean that the drug killed them. That doesn't even mean the drug was active, that they were actively intoxicated by the drug that at the time of death. And so this dude doesn't clarify any of this. He doesn't say how he was confirming that these people were dying of kratom. He doesn't say where he was taking the blood samples from so we could analyze whether the kratom concentration that he didn't present conveniently is even accurate. He doesn't address any of these things. He just says that it's being recognized as a drug that's found in dead people and leaves it at that. That is lying. That is misleading. That is purposefully withholding truth to confuse people. And he did so effectively. He sure as hell confused the hell out of me. And this is pretty much all I do is read about pharmacology and read about toxicology and read about drug use. And he had me scratching my head with some of the claims he was making because they are nonsense and they're misleading. And I have to believe he did that either intentionally or he is so ignorant that he was doing it on accident. And that's just as big of an issue. He then makes an appeal to emotion, unsurprisingly, because it's the only actual argument tactic that prohibitionists can use because their argument falls apart when faced with any level of data driven scrutiny. Right? He says, please don't legalize a drug that could lend itself to more poly drug overdoses. And it's like, okay, if I understand that reaction. I understand the emotional reaction to say all these people are dying from drugs. Maybe we just need to make them illegal so less people will use them and maybe less people will die. At some point, these people and us as a society in general are going to have to acknowledge that that has not worked. It has not prevented people from using drugs. It has not prevented addiction. It has not prevented drug distribution. It has prevented nothing. The only thing it has actually done is cause a huge rise of violent crime because only criminals are allowed to distribute drugs. And since Americans spend $150 billion a year on illicit substances, you can be guaranteed that these people are going to be fighting for that money. It has caused a rise in police brutality. It has caused a rise of drug overdose deaths. It has caused a rise of people in prison. The only people that prohibition is benefiting are police officers, politicians, and people who own private prisons. The American people are not benefiting from this. No one is going to benefit from kratom staying prohibited in Arkansas. This dude it is proving my point when he's sitting here saying, "Oh, we're pulling kratom out of the hands of a 25-year-old man." Okay, so you acknowledge that prohibiting the drug here did not keep him from using the drug and apparently dying from it, according to you. So we need to regulate this substance, which is what this bill was trying to do. We need to pass laws that say, hey, if you want to sell kratom, you need to have a license. So if you sell a contaminated product, we can track it back to you. If you want to sell kratom, you have to perform some form of analysis on it so the people using it know how much they're taking. That is how you make drug use safer. You don't get rid of drug use when you pass prohibitive laws. It doesn't do anything in that regard. Every single year, more people report using drugs over the course of the year. That has been a trend since like 1980. Every single year, drug use goes up in this country, even though it's illegal. This does not work, man. And I know that you want people to stop dying from drug overdoses, so how about you make it safer to use drugs? That's the only answer here. And I'm sure I'll say this again throughout the video, but it blows my mind that conservatives of all people are the ones so vehemently opposed to legalizing drugs, right? These are the people that are willing to die on the hill that the Constitution protects their right to own firearms. By the way, guns are designed to kill. They have no other design purpose. They are designed to be pointed at something and to destroy the thing it is pointing at. I own guns. I love guns. I'm not saying that everyone buys a gun to kill someone or something with, but that is the reason they're designed. They are designed to do damage. So I will not hear the argument that drugs are more dangerous than guns. It doesn't make any sense, right? These people are willing to make all of these same arguments that I make for drugs for their guns. They're willing to say, oh, if you make them illegal, the only people in possession of them will be criminals. That is true, and it'll also be the only people distributing them will be criminals, so there will be a lot of violence surrounding gun distribution. Um, it is their, I don't want to say God given right because I'm an atheist, but it is their right given by the American government to own firearms. It is also the right supposed to be given by the American government to use drugs. That's what life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness means. I'm at liberty to live my life and pursue happiness as I see fit, as long as I'm not preventing others from doing the same. And they do not uphold that promise. They are hypocrites. They have no problem using alcohol and would throw a fit if someone wanted to ban bourbon or cigarettes or cigars or chewing tobacco or dip or whatever. But whenever we try to use these same arguments for the drugs that we enjoy using, they won't hear it. But then they'll turn around and go on about the Second Amendment. The Declaration of Independence was the original document that signed this country. It's probably the most important and philosophical document that is attached to our country, and it promises us these rights that they consistently do not uphold for anyone that they don't agree with. So it just blows my mind that these are the people that are willing to go against the Declaration of Independence and not listen to their own arguments. If I replace the word guns with drugs and the arguments that they make, all of the arguments still make sense, but they will not hear it. And that is just mind blowing to me. There was one other thing he said that I want to just touch on real quick. It's kind of nitpicky, but given all the other stupid stuff he said, I feel like he deserves to be nitpicked a little bit. He said that kratom does not come from the opioid plant. What is the opioid plant? Kratom is a plant that contains an opioid. I assume you're talking about opium poppy, which is Papaver somniferum, which contains morphine, paramorphine, and a little bit of codeine. So again, this guy just doesn't know what he's talking about. He compares mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine to meth, which is just not even in the realm of being close to accurate. And then he says things like it's not the opioid plant. Like, I don't understand how this dude is the head coroner of Arkansas and is in a position to change or at least sway legislation in this state. Why are we allowing this dude to get away with this? Like, why did no one come up there after him? Why didn't the Department of Health correct him when they went up there? They're anti-kratom too. The reason they didn't correct him is because they were taking advantage of his misleading information. But why did they not say that, hey, we're against this drug, but it is not related to meth, and the phrase opioid plant doesn't mean anything? Okay, at least I could respect them for being honest, but they just kind of let that slide. I don't understand it. And we as a society should not allow people like him to be in positions like that.
Still listed as a chemical or drug of concern, even though it is not federally scheduled. The indications for specific issues with growing these products is that there are tendencies to have outbreaks with, there's been reported outbreaks of salmonella, also with heavy metals. Typically, if these products are grown in Southeast Asia, these products have
So then the Department of Health comes up there and they start talking about an issue that is caused by prohibition as a way to influence people to continue prohibiting kratom. He talks about how there is a tendency, especially when they're distributed from Southeast Asia, that these products contain salmonella and heavy metals. You know how to avoid that problem? Is to regulate the product and make them do analysis on it so we know if there's salmonella or heavy metals in the product. When it's prohibited, none of that regulatory oversight is taking place, and all you're doing is allowing them to sell contaminated products. You're not stopping anything when you prohibit the drug. You're not stopping salmonella outbreaks through kratom use. You are causing them. You're allowing them to happen. So if that is your concern, you would regulate the product.
Significant shift in the industry over the last year into products that have a higher amount or elevated amounts of 7-hydroxymitragynine, which is a potent interactant with the opiate receptor with a higher affinity in vitro than morphine. These products that
Next, he makes the claim that 7-hydroxymitragynine, which he pronounces mitragynine, 7-hydroxymitragynine, has a higher affinity for opioid receptors than morphine. That is not true. It is more potent than morphine, but it is still a partial agonist. Affinity is essentially the measurement of how powerfully or how effectively a molecule binds to a receptor. Higher affinity drugs fully activate the receptor, lower affinity drugs partially activate the receptor. Mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine both partially activate the mu-opioid receptor. Morphine, hydrocodone, heroin, oxycodone, they fully agonize the mu-opioid receptor. Now, what may be true is that um, mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, they may have higher affinity for the kappa and delta opioid receptors. However, they are competitive antagonists at that receptor, or at those receptors. They block the receptor from firing. They do so very effectively and very potently. It doesn't take much of either of these drugs to cause that effect. But in terms of the mu opioid receptor, which is the main mediating receptor in the brain for causing opioid effects like morphine and heroin and mitragynine, it does not have higher affinity than morphine for that receptor. I don't know if that was a slip up and that he meant it's more potent than morphine, which it certainly is. But potency does not measure the drug's power. Um, Affinity measures the drug's power. So even though 7-hydroxymitragynine is more potent than morphine, it still does not cause the same intensity of effects as morphine does. So again, that is misleading. Sure, it is more potent, but it does not have stronger binding affinity at that receptor. It just doesn't. Some studies even show that mitragynine is almost an antagonist at the mu-opioid receptor. Those studies are probably pretty flawed because we know that isn't the case. Like, you can't administer mitragynine to someone overdosing on heroin and save their life. It won't work. It'll probably make it worse. But that's just going to say that the binding affinity is so low with these drugs that some studies mistake it as an antagonist, right? Now, 7-hydroxymitragynine does have about 9 times the binding affinity of mitragynine, so it is a more powerful drug. There is no disputing that, but it is not a more powerful drug than morphine or heroin or hydrocodone. I do find it funny that he did not say heroin, because usually these guys are all over the heroin comparison. And the reason he didn't say it is because he knows it isn't true. He knows 7-hydroxymitragynine is not a stronger agonist than heroin. And if it's not a stronger agonist than heroin, it's not a stronger agonist than morphine, man, because morphine and heroin are the same drug.
the concerns with 7-hydroxymitragynine has a larger opiate profile with higher incidence of withdrawal symptoms. There's also
He then goes on to make that claim that 7-hydroxymitragynine has a higher opiate profile. Again, this is nitpicky, but I expect pharmacists and people who are being brought on as experts to use the right vocabulary. It is not an opiate profile, it's an opioid profile. Opiates are naturally occurring opioids that come from the Papaver somniferum plant. Opioids are any drug that mimic those effects. So mitragynine is an opioid, fentanyl is an opioid, hydrocodone is an opiate, morphine is an opiate, heroin is a semi-synthetic opiate, right? Any drug derived from morphine, codeine, or paramorphine are going to be called opiates because they come from the opium poppy. Any drug that does not come from that plant is called an opioid. So an opioid doesn't have an opiate profile, it has a opioid profile. And yes, it is a stronger opioid than mitragynine. That is not disputed. But it bothers me that these people can't even use the correct language when they're talking about this issue. And this highlights another problem that I would like to point out real quick. Mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine are listed in the Controlled Substance Act of Arkansas in Section C, which is opium derivatives. There is not a single part of mitragynine that is related to morphine or any of the other substances in opium, which is the waxy substance that comes out of a Papaver somniferum seed pod. They're not even in the same class of molecules. Mitragynine is a cornath type monoterpene indole alkaloid. Morphine is a benzoyl alkaloid. They don't even belong to the same class structurally, much less pharmacologically. So we can't even classify the drug correctly, and the experts coming up to the microphone can't even use the correct language when describing the drug. That is bothersome to me. These people should be able to do that. If our government is going to ban a drug, they should at least show us that they know enough about it to classify it properly.
As well to another metabolite, mitragynine pseudoindoxyl, which is also a very potent mu-opioid receptor, which is also interacts with the mu-opiates receptors. So
That video, he just caught himself. He was very close to saying I almost pronounced it like him, mitragynine pseudoindoxyl is a mu-opioid receptor agonist, which is the claim he was trying to make earlier when he said 7-HO has stronger affinity than morphine, but he caught himself and just said it interacts with the opioid receptors. And then he called them opiate receptors. So again, this dude is not even using the proper language, and he's being brought on as an expert. And he's trying to mislead people, which is why he's having to stumble around and be so careful with his words, because earlier he said it was a stronger binder to the mu opioid receptors than morphine when it's not. And then he almost just called it an agonist, which it's not. It's a partial agonist, which means that it doesn't have stronger binding affinity than morphine.
The mu-opiates receptors. So I would also indicate that there's also a significant interaction profile with these products into the cytochrome P450 enzyme systems in the body. These interactions can result in alterations in levels of specific medications that individuals may take, or may alter the levels of the other products that are being taken.
Okay, so this one actually kind of made me laugh a little bit. So he's talking about the cytochrome P450 enzyme in the liver, and mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine and many other substances do inhibit its production and effectiveness, basically. This enzyme helps metabolize a lot of different substances, drugs, food, etc., that comes into our system. And he's using this as a way to say, look, if people are taking kratom with their medication, it could cause a dangerous situation. And you know what? It probably could in some circumstances. However, he does not mention that it's not a very effective cytochrome P450 enzyme inhibitor. But the other thing he doesn't mention is that grapefruit juice is also a cytochrome P450 enzyme inhibitor. Um, Many things that we ingest all the time that are not psychoactive or dangerous inhibit this enzyme. It's a very common thing. That's why if you look at grapefruit juice or a beer that contains grapefruit, you'll typically see a label on there saying don't consume this with medications. And on a lot of medication bottles, you'll see that same tag talking about grapefruit juice. So he's using this as a way to say, look, it inhibits this enzyme, it's super dangerous, but a lot of things inhibit this enzyme. Like this is not something specific to kratom or mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine. You can find a ton of substances that do this, and he's not using that as ammo to prohibit grapefruit juice. So again, this is just using a bunch of scientific lingo and shit like that to confuse the people. One of the guys admitted that he's just a dirt farmer, so he's clearly just trying to confuse these guys into saying, "Oh my God, the scientists are saying all these big words and that it inhibits these enzymes. It must be terrible." It's so many things do that, and it blows my mind that he actually brought this up in this hearing. It's almost hilarious. So I'm gonna wrap this up. A guy who was in favor of passing the bill went up to the microphone and talked for a while. They cut him off. Um, they voted to end all testimony and then kill the bill, and they effectively did that. But even the guy who went up, I'm not a fan of. He was focusing on like potential medicinal benefit, and all that's good and great, and it is a natural product, which some people like. It does have pretty obvious potential medicinal benefits, but to me, that just isn't the point. That isn't what we should be focusing on here. We should be focusing on the idea that adults have the right to consume whatever they want to consume. We shouldn't be like, oh, we should allow them to take it because it may help with opioid withdrawal. I don't care about opioid withdrawal, right? Opioid withdrawal is one of the most treatable conditions in the world. We have a ton of things that can help treat opioid withdrawal. We have a bunch of stuff that can treat pain. So it's just not the point that this drug helps people. And I'm glad it does. I'm not trying to discredit the people it helps or anything like that. But the point here is that we are putting people in prison for consuming a product. We're not putting people in prison for hurting other people. They're not assaulting other people. They're not stealing from other people. They're not actually committing a crime. There's no one pressing charges on them for possessing kratom. It's the police officers and the government deciding when to press charges on them. There's no victim here. There's no crime, and we are throwing people in prison. A man named Marshall Price died in prison after being arrested for kratom possession here in Arkansas. What are we thinking? Why are we allowing that to happen? The only state that borders us that has kratom illegal is Mississippi. Everyone else has fine kratom laws, and they're getting along better than Arkansas is. Oklahoma's a better place to live than Arkansas in most situations. So is Texas. So is Missouri. So is Tennessee. It's not like they have this drug legal and their state is falling apart, or that people are killing people left and right, and that they got addicts living on the streets from kratom. We can look at our neighboring states that have legal kratom and say, wow, nothing is actually happening over there. Everyone seems to be doing just fine, and they have kratom on every corner. But here, we think about it like, oh my god, we found a seventh grader using it in the bathroom. We have to make sure no one ever touches this stuff. It's just the dumbest shit ever. And we got the Department of Health coming up to the microphone and just blatantly lying to people, trying to sneak like a bunch of scientific jumbo over people's heads. We got a coroner coming up there comparing it to methamphetamine, and then the guy who supports it's coming up there ranting about natural remedies. It's why was this the most amount of organization that the pro side could have organized? Why didn't they get someone who can actually refute some of the things that these other people said? Why didn't we get someone who can explain how kratom works without making it sound like nonsense, without mentioning liver enzymes that grapefruit also interacts with? It was a very disappointing outcome to this. It got through the Senate. I spoke at the study proposal hearing in Senate, and I think it was October or November, and things were going pretty well. We had like 15 scientists there. Some of them were the leading scientists on kratom in the world. They were here in Arkansas to speak about this act. And then when it comes time to actually pass it through the House, we have some dude ranting about acupuncture. I don't understand what happened here. But like I said, I'm glad it got to the House in the first place, right? This is how progress is made, but someone did say that the governor's office was opposed to it, so I have a pretty strong feeling that even if it passed through the House, Sarah Sanders probably would have vetoed it. Um, we just live in a backward state right now. We don't know what we're doing. Our laws don't make any sense. We got a dude incredulously defending himself by saying he's a dirt farmer when he mispronounced something. Those are the guys making our laws. And we have coroners comparing a partial agonist opioid to methamphetamine, helping sway their decisions. Eventually, we're going to have to stop letting this happen so our laws can make sense and so people stop having their lives ruined for possessing a product that the government doesn't like for a victimless crime. So, hopefully, we learn from this in Arkansas, and in 2027, whenever there's another hearing, we can get this bill passed and hopefully bring some more ammunition for the pro side next time we show up. Thank you guys for listening. That'll do it.